An old dream and fragile wings. In a nest dangling from the brittle branches of a once vibrant forest, a tiny bee was born. Her name was Rimasmal, quiet, and carrying on her back a pair of translucent wings as delicate as silk, so fragile that even a strong gust of wind could set them trembling. Yet despite her fragility, there was something else shining in Rima's eyes, a dream. When she was still a larva, Rima would curl into her mother's embrace, listening to her gentle voice whisper stories of days long gone times when bees didn't have to live among dust and debris, when they didn't have to fly through artificial flowers that only released machine-programmed scents. Her mother would whisper, "Once there were fields of lavender stretching purple all the way to the horizon. The farmers there smiled so kindly. They loved the bees like dear friends and always left the most fragrant blossoms just for us." Rima listened in awe. She didn't yet understand words like genuine smiles, real earth, or true flowers, but there was something in her mother's voice that made those things seem more precious than any drop of honey the hive had ever stored. Growing up in a hive stranded in a petrified forest, where every flower was programmed to bloom on schedule and watered by automated tubes, Rima still believed that somewhere, the old world must still exist. A place without steel fences around every field, a place where flowers danced in the wind, pollinated by nature itself, and where cool water flowed over stones just as her mother had described. And from the moment Rima learned to fly, that dream grew inside her like a quiet, glowing flame. Rima didn't want to just survive. She wanted to find the place where life still breathed. A place where bees could still fly freely through the untamed colors and fragrances of the earth and sky. The first flight, and a world already changed. On the day Rima was able to fly on her own, the sky was overcast, and there was no scent of lavender like in the stories her mother used to tell. But she took off anywhere, tiny trembling wings, beating rapidly, carrying a yearning far greater than fear, the longing to touch the real world. The sky that day was a dull gray, not the brilliant blue she had seen in digital photo books. Rima flew past revived forests entirely made of artificial trees, their outer shells crafted from organic plastic, their roots plugged into automatic watering systems. The flowers she came across, though symmetrical and flawless like printed artwork, had no scent, no taste, no breath of life. She hovered beside a brilliant red rose by the roadside. A glowing digital sign lit up. BioFlower, a product of Green Tech Corp. Self-regulating fragrance, blooms 24/7. Rima extended her tiny leg to touch the flower's core. There was no nectar, just a layer of synthetic gel, slimy, inedible, and impossible to bring home to the hive. Rima's heart sank. She flew on, spotting rows of earth sealed behind glass panels. Inside, robot bees performed their tasks, extracting pollen, processing data, managing artificial pollination systems according to coded commands. No one smiled. No one acknowledged her. No one needed a real bee. Rima descended onto the dry root of an old tree lying in the middle of a barren lot. There were no machines here, no electronic panels, no surveillance cameras. Only a leafless trunk and a tiny trail of moss struggling to reach for sunlight through the cracked stones. For the first time, Rima didn't feel out of place. She lay still and breathed, then looked up at the sky. There were no drones, no billboards, only a breeze soft and faintly earthy, carrying the scent of something raw and real. And at that very moment, a yellow butterfly fluttered past. It didn't glow, it wasn't tagged. It was simply free. Rima leapt up. In her small eyes, something lit up, Maybe this wasn't the legendary lavender field her mother spoke of. But if there was a real butterfly, real moss, a real breeze, then this land was still alive. She reached into her side pouch and drew out a single seed, wrapped in beeswax, a legacy seed passed down through generations of guardian bees. And in this place, where everything seemed forgotten, Rima began her journey to sow life once more. The first sign of life, and wings that came searching. The day Rima sowed the seed, the earth was still dry, the sky still overcast, and the world still too busy to care that a single real bee was trying to plant life with her tiny, trembling wings. There were no spectators, no lights, no applause. Only one solitary bee, a cracked patch of ground, and a seed no larger than a pinhead placed gently into the soil with all the love her heart could hold. Rima brought water in the form of dewdrops, collected each morning on her wings. Every dawn, she traded her strength for one more trace of leftover pollen, sprinkling it gently over the seed like a silent ritual. Every night, she curled beside the dry root, shielding the patch of soil with her own fragile body, willing to give her warmth so the root might keep its chance at life. And then, after 7 days of waiting that felt like forever, a tiny green sprout pushed its way up through the soil. It wasn't tall, it wasn't radiant, but to Rima, it was the most beautiful thing in the world. That little sprout, something the world had stopped believing in, was now alive, breathing, reaching slowly for the faint light piercing through the dusty sky. From afar, a pair of wings approached. At first, it was an old bee, wings tattered and slow, who landed silently beside Rima, saying nothing, just lying down next to her to help keep the sprout warm. Then came 2 young bees, born in artificial hives, each carrying a question no one had ever answered. Why don't flowers have a scent? They came. Then another group followed, bees once deemed useless, cast out of the artificial pollination systems for flying off course. They came too. None of them were summoned. None were promised anything. But somehow, all knew they had come searching for something real. And so, from one sprout, one little bee, and one land once thought dead, a new bee community was born. No orders were given. No rewards were offered. They simply chose to stay together, protecting life. That day, sunlight fell gently like silk. The bees flew in circles around the tiny plant, their buzzing forming an ancient melodious song that hadn't been heard in years. And from the smallest of dreams, life had begun to return. The once tiny sprout had now grown into a small bush. From that fragile patch of green, new seeds began to germinate. Every day, Rima and her fellow bees flew farther, scavenging for forgotten seeds found in cracked walls, corners of abandoned markets, and moldy clumps of soil from old storerooms. They brought them back, planted them, and nurtured them like silent, unseen gardeners. And then, something miraculous happened. The first blooming season arrived after decades of the land being labeled infertile. The blossoms weren't uniform. They weren't flawless like the ones in glossy tech ads. But each flower had a real scent, the scent of earth, of sunlight, of time itself. Some bloomed facing the sun. Some were so tiny you had to lean close to see them. But all of them carried a gentle fragrance, as if whispering, "Life is returning." Rimathe, little bee who once flew alone, was no longer alone. From every forgotten corner, swarms of small bees found their way back. They didn't look the same. Some had slender golden bodies, others striped brown wings, and some were once raised entirely in sterile lab tubes. Yet in their eyes, they all shared one thing, a longing to touch real flowers. the buzzing of bees began to hum across the sky. Not synthetic hums, not programmed frequencies from rooftop speakers, but the genuine rhythm of wings, rising like a forgotten melody of nature awakening once more. Beneath the roots, the soil began to stir. Tiny earthworms reappeared. Birds flew by, scattering fresh seeds. And a few curious humans from the protective zones wandered in, wide-eyed, their noses reddened and wet as they inhaled the scent of lavender for the first time in their lives. No one could believe a field like this had grown from a single seedling in land once dismissed as dead. That field was more than a home for flowers. It was a sanctuary of faith where the wings of small bees formed a new sky, where each bloom stood as living proof of the power of hope, nurtured day by day. And Rima, who once carried a lonely dream, had become an unspoken leader, the one who led the bees to remember why they fly. A final message from tiny wings and the beginning of a new world. As time passed, the land where Rima had once planted her first seed was no longer a forgotten patch of soil. It had become the bee forest, a green oasis in a world that had once choked on its own barrenness. From just a handful of early sprouts, an entire ecosystem had slowly returned. Grass curled around roots, mushrooms crept through the shadows, wildflowers bloomed with the seasons, bees swarmed freely, and water began to gather in natural pockets across the ground. Humans, those who had once turned their backs on nature, began to arrive. Not to exploit, but to learn how to live with the land once again. They didn't bring machines. They brought questions. How did the bee, such tiny creatures, do what we never could? The answer lay within Rima's story. The little bee was now old. Her delicate wings no longer beat with the strength of youth, but her gaze remained bright alive. Rima still rose early, circling the first blossoms of the day, checking the newly planted seeds tended by young bees, before settling beside the old tree, the place where she had once, all alone, pressed a single seed into the dry earth. One day, a group of children came to the bee forest with their parents. They ran through the grass in delight, eyes wide in wonder as they touched flowers that had real scent. A small girl approached Rima, gently asking, "How did you begin all of this?" Rima looked at her, saying nothing. She simply opened her fragile wings, flew one slow loop over the blooming bush, and landed softly beside a new seed. That act spoke louder than any words. Start with something small and never give up. As the sun set, the meadow resonated with the hum of bees like a lullaby for the Mother Earth. There were no more industrial lights, no more neon, just the deepening violet sky and the soft flutter of wings sowing life into the land. That night, Rima slept under the starlit sky just as she always had, but this time, the wind carried the scent of the future, the smell of green things, of lavender, and of hope. A new world had begun, not built on advanced technologies, not shaped by control, but born from belief in the simplest truth of all. Life doesn't need orders. It only needs love. The next morning, as dawn gently kissed petals still wet with dew, the bees took flight once more. Their humming rose like the opening movement of a new symphonion that signaled the beginning of a new era where life was no longer secondary to profit, and green was no longer something to be recreated, but something to be protected with all the heart. Rima's little bee, who had once flown alone through a chaotic world, no longer flew as swiftly as before. But now, she no longer had to do everything on her own. Beside her were thousands of wings, young bees now fully grown, bees once cast aside, and even new humans. Children who learned to plant seeds before learning to code, who knew to place a bowl of water for the bees before learning how to build a robot. The beehive was no longer just a home, it had become a symbol. People began rebuilding community forests, not from concrete and LED panels, but from seeds, real soil, and hands reaching back toward nature. In these places, every flower became a promise, every drop of water a gift, and every little bee quiet revolutionary carrying the mission to preserve life itself. Rima had lived a full bee's life, not long, but long enough to create something far greater than herself. On the day she finally rested beneath the old tree, the entire bee forest fell silent. The bees flew in a wide circle, dropping tiny lavender petals over her still form, a farewell to the one who had dared to dream, dared to begin, dared to live every beat of her wings with purpose. At the top of the hive, a new phrase had been carved into the old wooden plaque, where small things become miracles. And if you are reading this story now, maybe you are not Rima, but you can still plant a seed. Place a bowl of water for the bees. Turn off the lights so the trees can rest. Or simply kneel, touch the earth and listen to the heartbeat of life. Because a truly living world begins, not with grand gestures, but with small wings that never give up. You've just heard the story of Rima, little bee with a big dream. If Rima's journey has touched your heart, if you've ever felt small in this vast world, yet still long to do something meaningful, please don't leave in silence. Tap like on this videos, a flutter of wings, a boost of strength for all the hearts still planting seeds of hope. Share this video so this small story can fly farther, reaching those who may be needing a reason to believe in life again. And subscribe to our channel where every video is a seed, every story a blooming petal, and every viewer an irreplaceable part of the green garden we're growing together. Turn on notifications so you won't miss our next stories where nature finds its voice and small things awaken extraordinary miracles. And if you know someone living quietly like Rima, someone who, without asking for credit, helps keep the world breathing, send this video to them as a heartfelt thank you from the bottom of your soul. Because sometimes it's the quietest among us who end up changing the whole planet. Some